Okay, button here. Good. I think so.
Let's
Like
hear
that.
let's hear you, Liz.
Hello.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Yeah, you too.
We can just get right into this thing. I'm glad you guys made some time to chat with me today. I think I have the right people for this conversation.
Yeah, well, thanks for thinking of us.
Always. So, Liz, you literally wrote the book, right? You wrote the book on this early punk scene in Toronto. Your book is called Treat Me Like Dirt, an oral history of punk in Toronto and beyond.
Yes. Yeah. I yeah, I read that book. I mean, it's funny to still it's not funny to still be talking about it, but it came out 15 years ago. So it's great that people are still interested in it and that that history continues to resonate. At the time that I was working on it, and the reason that I wanted to start it was that it seemed like a lost history. There wasn't a lot of documentation around Toronto punk. There had been some media coverage when the movement first started in Toronto, but a lot of the media coverage was actually quite critical of punk and made fun of it a lot. It wasn't so much an effort to archive what was happening or to give it any sort of cultural significance. And so it was really challenging for me to find anything about punk in Southern Ontario, which is what I was really driven to find out about, just for myself as a fan. And so when I started the book, it was really coming from a place that was a labor of love for me because I was so curious as to what had happened here.
And when does Kire enter your life? Like, Kire, your dad was in the Vile Tones.
Yeah. I remember getting a phone call from Liz asking me for my dad's phone number. That was our first interaction. You're trying to get a hold of him. And then just after that, you did a news article on me for the Toronto Star.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, because Kire has an interesting story on his own in that his dad was in the Vile Tones. But at the time, Kire was starting to work on a documentary with a filmmaker named Colin Brunton that covered, yes, The Last Pogo Jumps Again, that covered the same scene and era that I was looking at in my book. And I thought that Kire would be a really interesting story. I was a freelance journalist at the time, and I thought that's an interesting story to have this young adult who is now documenting his father's history in the punk scene, and so that was how we met, and that's how we first became friends, and then eventually we got married.
Oh, kind of wild that you're a couple here. Kire was over here fairly recently, and the email came from you, Liz, that
Yeah.
suggesting, and I don't know, like I'm not the brightest light in the chandelier. Like I'm kind of these pieces are all revolving around. I'm not putting them together, but Kire's dad was a founding member of the Vile Tones with Stephen Leckie, who we're going to talk about in a moment. And I've had Colin Brunton over here. I moderated that panel in the Red Room at the Masonic Temple when Gary Topp's book came out. I know Stevie Leckie was there, but this whole happenstance that you two are together, and I feel like you're the two I need to talk to now because I'm trying to understand Steve Leckie's role in the Toronto music landscape, and I'm trying to separate the man, the legend, if you will, from the myth. And I think this conversation will help me in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a lot to talk about when it comes to Stephen.
Well, let's talk about it. So, Liz, kick us off. So, I don't even know where to begin, but I mean, I know that Stephen Leckie forms the Vile Tones in like 1976. Kire's dad is there. There's a chap named Mike Anderson. Everybody has these stage names. I feel like Chris's dad's name, Chris Haight. Sorry, Kire's dad's name, Chris Haight, far more appropriate than the name that Stevie Leckie went by, which was what, Nazi Dog. Can you just bring us back? Who was Stephen Leckie? Tell me about the Vile Tones in the late '70s.
Yeah, so Stephen Leckie was a singer of a band called the Vile Tones, and the Vile Tones were considered to be, let's say, one of the more notorious punk bands in Toronto, but also one of the most, I think, important and influential punk bands to come out of the early Toronto scene when I was first discovering punk, that there had been a punk movement in Toronto, the Vile Tones were one of the first bands that I heard about. And whenever you mentioned Toronto punk, Stephen Leckie and the Vile Tones would be top of mind for anyone else who was familiar with that scene and that music. And so Stephen was a really important figure in the city and in Canadian music history on a whole. But you're right. There are things to critique about Stephen. He did adopt the name Nazi Dog, and at the time, it was common for people in the punk movement to have monikers and take on personas, and there was a significant flirtation with Nazi symbolism, which we didn't just see in Toronto. We saw it also in punk movements in the UK and in the US, and that was seen as a sort of a subversive act. But in this day and age, in 2025, I think a lot of people see it differently, and I don't think that punk would happen in quite the same way if it were to happen to start fresh from this moment on.
But that context is so key because I was getting my hair cut yesterday, and my barber is this musician, and they play this thrash metal. Shout out to Phantom Lung. But we're chatting about it, and I mentioned he went by the name Nazi Dog, and it almost was a conversation ender right there. Like, where do we go from here? But you need that context that for whatever reason, that punk movement in the mid to late 70s, there were like swastikas on people's jackets and the word Nazi flying around. Like today, that's a scene ender, right? Like that's a
Yeah,
non-starter.
it really is. And a lot of people who I interviewed for Treat Me Like Dirt disowned a lot of that, and they didn't all participate in that imagery. And a lot of them were uncomfortable with it as it was happening. So it's not something that was adopted across the board with everybody. And it's not something that the rest of the Vile Tones stood behind either. They were not comfortable with it either. But Stephen was the kind of person who wanted to push boundaries, whatever boundaries he perceived needed to be pushed. And he wanted to be controversial, and he wanted to court a sense of danger. Whether, I think sometimes it was coming from a naive place, to be honest. I don't think that he was actually uh, looking to always align himself with the type of statements that you might assume he was. I think he was very young when the Vile Tones started. He was still in his late teens, and I just, I think that he was caught up with punk almost as being a caricature. And we see that sometimes throughout that history with different individuals as well, right? Sid Vicious is another one who comes to mind from the UK scene, who was in the Sex Pistols. Some people just almost take on it's like they feel like they have to live the idea of punk to such an extreme, that they do things that feel very unrelatable.
So on that note, and again, I'm much older than you, but not old enough to have seen any of this scene. Like I completely missed it. I kind of lived vicariously through the musicians I have over and people like you who document it. But like my understanding is Steven would like routinely cut himself with broken bottles and razor blades when he was on stage. Like this was, we always heard this about like Iggy Pop, right? Like just cutting himself on stage. But there's a story out of New York on July 7th, 77. That was 7/7/77, where he's cutting his arms open on stage at CBGB's with shards of beer glass that were just like broken on the floor. Like just imagining this. This is sort of a larger than life, wild and crazy scene.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what Stephen wanted, and that was one of the things that he was known for, and that's another example of him taking things to an extreme. And you're right, it wasn't he wasn't the only one doing it. Um, but I think there's something about Stephen. who may, this is speculative, but from what I feel I know about Stephen, I think that part of him felt like he had to take it that far.
Like basically go big or go home.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's true that he had to, right? He could have just focused on singing and honing a skill as a singer and really focusing on developing some kind of talent as a musician. But I don't think that Stephen was actually a musician. I think he was an artist, and I think in particular he was a performance artist. The Baltones have great songs, but I don't think that people are going to hate me for this, but I don't think Stephen was a really great singer. And I don't, I don't, I don't think he was a great singer, but he was a great front person, and he knew that that's what he was doing. He knew he was putting on this show. But you can only do that for so long as well, right? You can't. It's not a sustainable career path to be the person who's up on stage uh, flirting with that level of self-harm and self-destruction forever. There has to be an endpoint to it. And I don't know if he worked out his way past what that endpoint would be.
So Kire, I got to ask you, since your dad knew Steve Leckie back in the mid 70s there, I guess one of my questions is to get it back to the music, like Liz was talking about there. What, like when you hear a song, I just off the top of this episode, I'm playing some Screamin' Fist. It's almost, I think it might be like the more accessible of the of the
Yeah.
Violence Tones catalog there. But what do you think of the music?
I think the songs are great. I think there's a lot of great songs. That's the one good thing. Yeah, I mean, I guess I have a bias, but no, I think what they created together in a short time. I mean, that lineup only lasted maybe like between 12 and like maybe like 15 months. It was really quick. So what they were able to do in that short time, I think, was amazing. Really only had 245s, and then yeah, that CD came out in the 90s with all like other recorded tracks at the time. So um, yeah, no, I love the music. I think it's again, Steven's not a great singer, but I don't think it really matters. I think it kind of lends itself to what they were trying to achieve. So yeah.
So where again, I'm trying to educate those who miss this scene, and he's not exactly a household name, right? Like in the Vile Tones, because they're not exactly, yeah, they're not exactly a household name. The average music fan in the city probably doesn't know a Vile Tone song or who the heck Stephen Leckie is. But was it the punk persona, the larger than life charismatic frontman that, was killing on stage live? Or was it the music? Like, what is it specifically that made Stephen Leckie such a icon for music lovers in this country, the city, particularly those who look back at the mid 70s to early 80s punk movement?
I think it was both. I think the show was a big thing because like people, you never knew what he was going to do.
Right.
There was always that kind of excitement around what's Steven going to do tonight. I mean, he also talked about like killing himself on stage multiple times. Right, I'm going to kill myself. So people would show up like, it's tonight. Steven's going to kill himself on stage, right? So there's like that kind of stuff always brought people down, I think, as well. And just like the element of danger. There's a lot of danger and like violence around the band because Stephen had befriended a kind of group of thugs from East End called the Blake Street Boys, who would come to shows and they were kind of like Stephen's like security. And if Stephen would not like someone, if he wanted to start things up, he would like sick these people on random people in the audience, right? If someone didn't look punk enough or cool enough, or he would kind of send these guys after these guys, And so there was always that element of danger and violence, I think, drew some people as well. Again, just we never sure, like, not sure what was going to happen. I think no two shows were ever the same with the Vile Tones, right? So
Well, danger is exciting. Like I get excited hearing the story, but also that's
yeah,
real danger, right? Like,
yeah. I don't know. There's people who got like really beat up badly at their shows, and like it's they it's traumatic and they still think about it and stuff, because Steven was an idiot and kind of sick these people on them, that kind of stuff, right? So. Um, I think that was a big part of it. Definitely was the show and who he was. But I think the music itself. I mean, the live recordings of the band, they're not great. They're like they'd be trash sometimes, or it's I think when you hear those studio albums, like yeah, they were probably a little more sober and together and practicing, so they came together better. But I think a Volatone show, it could have went either could have been if they were sober, it was probably pretty good musically. If they weren't sober, it was probably terrible, but it made up, but it was just again, it was a crazy show, so it was just fun to be around, right? So yeah.
And you worked with Colin Brunton on the last Pogo Jumps again, which we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
What was your
Yeah.
experience like with Stephen Leckie at that time
Um,
and beyond?
Mine was he was kind of reluctant to talk to us at first. I think you probably had an easier time speaking to him than we did with your book, but eventually he came around. And then we did a long sit down interview with him in a park. And that was basically it, and it was like a few hours long. We got everything I needed to get out of the way. I think the good thing is talked to Steven kind of later while filming, so I kind of knew exactly what I needed to get from him to make it work. Because I think if we tried to go back to him, it probably wouldn't have gone so well. But yeah, we sat in the park and he laid everything out. I think he was pretty upset with how he was portrayed in the film, unfortunately. Although I think it's who he is, so that's something he's gonna has to deal with. So there was a lot of hate towards me and Colin afterwards, for sure. So, but to his credit, I remember like he came to the premiere of the movie and he sat through 3.5 hours of people like yelling at him on stage and booing him and laughing at him. And he sat there the whole time and he was pretty quiet after the screening and kind of just left. But yeah, I mean, it's not easy to sit through 3 hours and a half of a room packed of people like booing you and laughing at you and stuff, right? So
So,
yeah,
but he was not happy with how he was portrayed in the last Pogo Jumps again.
no, and I don't even think in the book if I'm, I
So here's the thing about Steven. Steven loved publicity. He wanted to court the media. He, in my experience, he wanted to be interviewed. He wanted to be talked about. And when I was working on my book, he would call me almost every day for about 2 years. And a lot of the time, he would want to know who I'd interviewed that day for my book, if I'd interviewed anybody, and if they talked about him, if they mentioned him, and if they remembered him. He really, really wanted to be remembered. But I think that he, was a very sensitive person as well. And he didn't handle or didn't know how to handle those emotions. And so when he saw the stories about him reflected back to him, whether they were in a print article, whether they were in the documentary, whether they were in the book, I don't know if he knew how to sit with that, if it wasn't outright praise or if it wasn't how he perceived himself to be. And I don't actually know how he perceived himself to be because he seemed like he wanted to be known as this wild, uninhibited, unpredictable individual. But he could be very difficult, as much as he wanted to have press and publicity around him. I did some stories because he was getting the Viletones back together when I was working on my book, a different lineup. They had some shows coming up and I did some freelance pieces around those shows. And I had mentioned when, as you do often in an interview, I set it up just saying I met up with Stephen Leckie over a couple pints at a bar on Queen Street. Here's what we talked about. And he would call me up, why did you say we met at a bar? Why did you say we were drinking? And it's like, Stephen, we were. It's the truth. No one cares. No one's going to judge you. You're a punk singer. No one cares if you had a couple beers. They assume you had a couple beers. But sometimes there were just certain details that he would get really spun out about, and you wouldn't be able to figure out why that thing upset him so much. When there would be other stories about him that he didn't seem bothered by at all. And I think that when the documentary came out, he also chose to drink on camera. And I think that I think when you go on the record with the media, you have to be aware of what you're doing and what you're saying. And he seems to have trouble sometimes I think taking responsibility or having any kind of self-awareness around how he was putting himself out there. And it's yeah, it's a funny thing. It was a really, I think, contradictory way for him to behave, but that's also Stephen, and Stephen was known for getting into his head with things. He was known for burning bridges with a lot of people who were his biggest supporters. And Kire and I are fans of Stephen. We still, as much as he gave us grief over things. We never didn't like him, and it wasn't personal, right? It's your job when you're documenting something. You're trying to capture all of those angles. You're trying to tell the whole story. It's so part of it too is our job to, it's not to coddle our sources, right? It's to capture all of that information because it's all interesting. We're telling, Stephen is an interesting story. I don't know if he always realized how interesting he was.
Interesting is a great word for it. I find myself drawn to characters. Like I've been this way a long time, particularly with the Toronto Mike series, which is like 1,700 episodes deep. Like I'm interested in interesting characters, and I'm now thinking back to how close I came to actually talking to Stephen on Toronto Mike. And I'm not going to name this FOTM, but he's from this scene. We'll just say he's from the scene that you wrote about, Liz. I'll tell you after the recording who it was. But I was warned by him, and I'm just going to quote this unnamed FOTM, that Stephen was quote unquote batshit crazy. This was the quote. And I remember thinking, oh, part of the problem when you're drawn to characters and want to kind of talk to characters is that sometimes they are carrying some mental health baggage and some challenges and stuff that can, we talked about we used the word dangerous earlier. Like sometimes it could be a little dangerous. And even hearing you, Liz, talk about those phone calls and wanting to be talked about, but not liking how it is portrayed in this whole complex, it sounds like maybe Stephen is interesting because Stephen might have been more than just a great artist and fascinating, charismatic frontman for the Vile Tones, but he may have been dealing with some challenges beyond the physical.
It's possible, I think anything like that, yeah, is speculative because if he ever had those struggles, it wasn't anything that he divulged, but he was a very complicated person. And he struggled with things. He struggled with sobriety. There were times when he had gotten sober and he went to, he was going to meetings, he was getting his life together. And then, there were other times when that wasn't Stephen at all. And the Stephen that we knew was not sober Stephen. Um, and I think there were a lot of things that he did sit with, and I don't know, all the ins and outs of his inner workings. I only know, the things that I could perceive in him and the things that he chose to share. But I think too, he had an immense amount of pressure on himself to live up to the mythos that he had started, to live up to this name of being Stephen Leckie. He never really broke away from that, right? And he would go through these phases where, every several years or so, he'd want to get the band back together and do a bunch of shows, and then that would fizzle out again. And a lot of the guys he worked with over the years couldn't work with him after a while because again, he was really difficult. But he wanted this, but he couldn't organize himself to get to that next level that I think a lot of people saw he could get to. And there's no, I don't think there's anybody in the scene who people wanted to see win as much as they want to see Stephen win. But there was just something about him where he was the ultimate saboteur in his own plans. He just, I don't know. It was, yeah. He was really, again, complex person, extremely charismatic. He could be really lovely. I know he could be an incredible person to sit and listen to and so articulate. But then, yeah, he could also just be such a pain in the ass.
Kire, I have a question regarding your father.
Yep.
So Your father is a founding member of the Vile Tones going back to 1976.
Kind of. It's a bit so. Their first show at the Colonial Underground was a different bass player for one show, guy Jackie Death. He did one show, and then for whatever reason he left, and then my dad came in. So from
Okay.
that second show until their demise after the second EP, that yeah. So like all the important like the original stuff, all that music is my dad was a part of.
Right.
Yeah.
And that second EP, I guess that's Look Back in Anger.
Yeah, so speaking of self-sabotaging, my dad has a good story about they just finished recording that album. They're gonna release it, and they were celebrating. My dad thinks it was the Keg Mansion or something, and then all of a sudden he said that knives were being thrown around the room at each other, and like it was just gone crazy, and like basically it was kind of like just finished this whole new album, and the whole thing band just kind of fell apart basically right at the end of that. So again, they were kind of on like definitely like an upward trajectory, and like Steven for whatever reason, decided to kind of put a stop to that. I don't maybe he was afraid maybe of what success looked like, maybe. I don't know. Maybe he felt like if he got too big, he couldn't handle it or wouldn't know what to do, or maybe, just I mean, there's a story Margarita Passion tells in the last Pogo Jumps again, the first time she had met Steven, he came over to her place because she was married to Freddie Pompey, the guitarist, and she mentioned that Steven was so shy he wouldn't sing in front of her. Like she had to go upstairs because Steven was so because he was too shy to sing in front of her. So it's like there's kind of this like duality of Steven where yeah he could be this kind of like crazy larger than life on stage guy, but also obviously had some insecurities at least early on, right? So yeah.
Well, so the formation is 76, and this EP we're talking about, Look Back in Anger, that's 1978. Okay.
Yeah.
A
So the
whopping
first,
2 years
yeah,
later.
yeah.
But
So the first album, the self-titled 77, and then
right.
the second one 78. Yeah, yeah.
Right. And that first, so that in that first album, is that the one with Screamin' Fist on it
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Rebel and Possibilities and these
yeah,
songs? Okay.
yeah. And that's the one most people really seem to gravitate towards. I mean, I think people like the second EP. It's a bit different because by that point it was a five-piece, and the sound was changing a little bit. Like my dad moved the guitar for that second EP, and they brought Screaming Sam on bass from The Ugly. So it was again things were already kind of changing by that second EP. But that first one though was the one that people really kind of I identify with. Yeah.
But when you're looking at the history of this band, it's so 2 years deep, and basically the whole band minus Stephen Leckie leave the band and go form the Secrets.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess I'm wondering, is that a Leckie thing? Like, hey, we can't play with this guy because
Oh,
when you
100%. Yeah, yeah, yeah. They couldn't deal
so,
with him. Yeah, yeah. So it was just yeah, I think because I think they all were upset that they were really working hard towards building this thing, and they were kind of getting momentum, and then Steven kind of throws a monkey wrench in everything, right? And it's kind of like, well, why do we need this guy? Because like people like my dad have been playing like hit thing like Steven. I'm sorry, my dad and Freddie Pompey were like almost like 10 years older than Steven. Like they'd been around the block, like they'd done proper, they were around their bands, they'd kind of done this before. So Steven was kind of like fresh-eyed young kid, and so I think they just got tired of that, and it's like, well, we don't need him, we can just do our own thing, right? So
so the Vile Tones that plays the Horseshoe Tavern for the last Pogo is this new lineup after your dad and everybody else leaves.
correct, yeah, 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 yeah. It's him, Tony, Torture, and Sam, Screaming Sam from The Ugly, and I forget who the guitarist was. I don't think he lasted very long, whoever that was either. So,
By
yeah.
the way, the more we chat, the more fascinated I am by this extremely complicated character that was in our midst until this past week. And I'm glad that we're just talking about it because I think it would be easy to say, punk legend influenced many, rest in peace. Like that's sort of like the lazy, there you go. Stephen Leckie was whatever he was, 67 years old or whatever. But there's so many layers here. Like maybe Liz, just because you literally wrote the book on this scene, like could you just remind the youngins what the heck happened at the last Pogo. I had Colin Brunton down here. We dove in deep, but in case they missed the Brunton episode of Toronto Mike, the last Pogo, Horseshoe Tavern, May 1st, 1978. The Vile Tones played that. What happened?
Yeah, I mean the last Pogo was supposed to be the Horseshoe had decided that they didn't want to do punk bands anymore. And so the last Pogo was going to be the last punk show at the Horseshoe, and a lot of people, to this day have attachment to that venue.
Sure.
Um, and so I think there was a lot of energy already around that night, and kind of thinking, this venue is turning its back on us, and sometimes within music scenes, venues start to feel like a second home, and venues also are scarce, right? Everybody's always looking for a place to play, and so when you lose a place to play, it's painful. And for a venue to decide they're not booking a certain genre anymore is even worse, right? It's almost worse than if a venue's closing, right? At least you can't fight the closure, but you can argue against someone's decision not to book your band anymore. And so I think there was already a lot of tension in the room that night. But the last Pogo kind of devolved as the night went on. The music got cut, the cops arrived. It just sort of disintegrated into chaos. And of course the Horseshoe survived, and of course now the Horseshoe books all kinds of bands again. So it was a moment in time. But I think looking at that, the reaction to such an important Toronto venue, looking at that reaction to a punk show really speaks to what was happening at the time. Now we take it for granted that punk is a popular genre, and it's been a very long running genre, and punk style has become so iconic that it's just part of the mainstream now. You see it on the street without realizing it. I don't know. I'm not talking about dog collar punk rock with and spiky hair. If you look at the style of punk in 1977 and 78, it was tight jeans and striped t-shirts, right? And again, style that you see all over the place now. But the attitude towards it at the time was there's a lot of resistance to it. And that's another thing that's hard to imagine in our context today, where things are so much more open here, right? It's common to see people who have a lot of tattoos and colored hair and everything. You don't think anything of it. But at the time, that kind of stuff would stop traffic. And there were generation gaps happening within the same generation around punk rock, where a lot of people really didn't understand it, and they thought it was frightening, it was confusing, it was so subversive, and those are the important things I think that we miss when we skip over the history of Toronto, because there's a lot that happened in the city, and those bands, the Vile Tones included, those bands did a lot for local music there, because they really had to break a lot of barriers so that more venues would be open to different genres, and more venues would be open to independent bands and original music.
So if we open up the scene to not just Toronto, but let's say GTHA, right? Like Greater Toronto, Hamilton area, we got to get Teenage Head in the mix there, right? So where does the Vile Tones rank in terms of the GTHA punk scene of the late 70s, early 80s?
I think they're right at the top. I think I mean, for me, the go-to bands of that time are Teenage Head, the Vile Tones, the Diodes. Then you
Forgotten
get
Rebels?
Forgotten Rebels, yeah, absolutely. And then
Maybe Demics?
the Demics from London, Ontario, yeah. Then you get into the B Girls and the Curse, and Simply Saucer was out there doing their thing. But yeah, I always have the Vile Tones right at the top. I think that they're one of the bands that continued to be remembered, and that were being still talked about, even if it has been on a smaller scale. That was one of the bands that was always talked about when Toronto punk came up, and so there was a lot of their memory lived on, and people have kept it alive, and I think that says something about them.
Well, if anything good can come from the sad passing of Stephen Leckie, it's that maybe people will sort of catch wind that, oh, there's a scene I missed, because that's an easy scene to miss, right? Like there's no it's you could miss it if you weren't going to the live shows. So maybe people will sort of dive in, read, learn more about this scene they missed, and buy your book, Liz, which is so dense. But I do want to shout out and ask you about one more thing that happened in 1980, because I have booked in my calendar in August. Stark Naked and the Flesh Tones are coming by to talk about Stark Naked and the Flesh Tones. And I know they played that Toronto City Hall event in 1980, the Rock Against Radiation. So, Liz, maybe since you wrote the book, maybe talk a little bit about what happened there, because I was reading Chris Houston's take on what happened with the Forgotten Rebels playing with the Vile Tones at that event. But to me, this story thrown in the mix, it's almost all like, wow, did this really happen? Like sometimes I have to check and see, like, is this a movie I saw or did this actually happen?
Gosh, I'm having trouble recalling
Okay,
that.
so I'll help you out. Okay, that's okay. Chris Houston was just remembering this when he learned about Stephen Leckie, but apparently Leckie had a plan. He was going to steal the show by announcing he was pro-nuclear. So this is Rock Against Radiation, right? So he had this plan. Is this ringing a bell yet, or?
No, it sounds believable.
Oh yeah. So then, but the Forgotten Rebels, I guess, learned of this plan backstage, and the Rebels were going to play before the Vile Tones, and the Rebels decided to steal this plan and basically did what Steve Leckie wanted to do and got a whole whack of like press that day of this punk band at City Hall for this Rock Against Radiation being pro-nuclear. Like this was the Leckie plan that was completely stolen by the Forgotten Rebels. So,
Yeah. So, the thing about Steven is there's so many great stories, and you're not really sure how much of it is bullshit and how much of it is actually reality. And I think that's for me what I like most about him and I'm gonna miss is like kind of like the lore is kind of ending now. Like, there's not gonna be more crazy stories of Steven kind of coming out. Because there's so many interesting stories about Steven. And yeah, so I think for me, I'm gonna miss that kind of stuff where it's, can you believe this? Steven did this and did
like
that. So,
to borrow a like a WWF term, like is it a work or a shoot? Right? Like I have
oh,
no idea. Like,
um,
yeah, go ahead.
good question. That's tough. I don't know because I don't really feel like I really knew Stephen Lucky, like the real Stephen Lucky. I don't know if he even knew the real Stephen
But did you
Lucky.
like is he a guy? I'm just trying to curious. I'm not your
Yeah.
therapist here, but like, would you want to go for a coffee with Stephen on a Saturday afternoon and catch up with Stephen Leckie? Was he the kind of guy you'd want to have a coffee and a convo with?
Yeah.
Well, I would because I think I'm drawn to characters like you are.
Okay.
You know what I mean? And like that's
And
something.
Liz would.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because it would be interesting,
Yeah.
right? Again, he was so interesting and he um he could just he did talk a lot of shit and he could just kind of ramble on about things, but he had a great use of language, and whatever he was talking about, he could make it sound interesting. And he did have so many stories, and sometimes he also was a story, right?
Right.
And before I had ever met him, um, I would hear about, we'd call them Stephen Leckie sightings. You'd hear about him, go to Suspect Video on Queen Street and having, interactions with the staff there or whatever, right? There'd always be these little stories about him floating around the city. So it's strange to think that he's not around anymore, and those
Yeah.
even those little sightings are over now. But he could be so interesting. I think the challenge with Stephen for a lot of people was that he he was really needy in a lot of ways, and he didn't, again, always know how to, I think, sit with his feelings, and so he liked people who could offer him something, right? Like writers and journalists who could maybe talk about him or get him in the press, but then when they didn't do things exactly how he wanted, or when they weren't um always flattering to him, he would get upset. Or he also might realize that if you have a relationship with someone, like a friendship, it has to go both ways. And sometimes people might also need to talk to you. You can't just be the one talking all the time. You can't be the one getting all the attention. You have to give back as well. And I don't know if he was always great at reciprocating the type of effort that people were willing to give him. Because, like I said earlier, people really wanted to see Stephen win and they wanted to be friends with Stephen, but he could be really a difficult person to be friends with. But I think that we're both really grateful that we got to spend time with him and we got to know him and we got to archive some of his life, whether he liked the way we did it or not, because he was a really important person in Canada, and I think there are a lot of the artists from that time did something that was really significant that unfortunately Canadian culture hasn't paid enough attention to, and that's typical for Canada. We tend to praise artists from outside of here. We don't do a really good job of looking at what's happening from within, and that's an unfortunate situation for us because then you have whole generations of people thinking that punk rock just came from England or just came from New
Right.
York City,
Yeah,
and they
it's
have no
Sex
idea
Pistols,
it
and then it was the
happened
Ramones, and then they're like yada
exactly.
yada yada. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that it could be a really exciting thing for younger people to understand that they had their own punk movement here. And that it was just as interesting as anything you'll hear about from the Sex Pistols or the Ramones or anyone else.
No, well said. A lot of thoughts in my head. One is I just want to thank you both for sharing these stories. I think you're doing important work, and I hope you keep it up because you sharing these stories means dummies like me have a place to go to catch up. So thank you.
No
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah. Thanks for asking us.
And just a little more on Stevie. I feel like I could talk hours about this gentleman. Quick question: Did he ever Did he ever say to you, Liz? I regret giving myself the moniker Nazi dog. Like, did he actually at some point realize this was a poor choice of handles?
I don't recall. I know that I remember other band members like Chris and Freddie Pompey and Motor Mike were not comfortable with it.
I mean, no, he
Yeah.
never he never did to me. But although
Yeah.
there's other like weird, you'll find like the odd clip online where I remember I saw one he was talking to someone from City TV. And this is like maybe like late 80s, and he's like he did kind of regret it because he went through different phases, right? I mean, Steven, yeah, he did get sober for a bit. Like, the band went like, they went rockabilly for a while. They weren't even punk anymore. So like it was an interesting kind of like journey. But I think by the time he got back to when we kind of ran to him again, I remember asking him that, and he didn't have any issues with it. It was
I'm
kind of
just curious. Like,
just a way to kind of get attention, he thought, it was just like another way to kind of
yeah, I'm wondering. I'm just
people did,
curious.
it was easy. Yeah, I think it was easier back then, is also in the late 70s to like get attention for saying something outrageous or being outrageous. It's a bit harder now. People have kind of caught on to that, but
Right.
at the time,
So to wind us down here, and I've learned a lot, but I feel like the more we talk, the more questions you have. That really, I need to sit down with Stephen Leckie, and that's never going to happen, sadly. So what I hear almost like he was almost like a charismatic frontman, a superhero of sorts on stage, great stage presence, and then he had the theatrics surrounding it, the very punk theatrics with the cutting, etc. And that he was also simultaneously, concurrently, very, very human with all the flaws that come with humanity. And this is the contrast, right? Where you have this larger than life Iggy Pop like punk legend and this complicated, flawed human, and hence all the fascinating stories that I've been inundated over this past week. And I, again, thank you both for chatting with me about Stephen Leckie.
Yeah,
no
thank
problem.
you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hopefully he appreciates it.
All right.